and welcome to another episode of Higher Ground Radio. I'm your host, Irvin Wainwright, and today we're going to be discussing some things that I think are very important to the African American community. Namely, we always talk about mental health because that's what this show is actually about. And so we talk about mental health, and we also discuss social issues as well too that affects our mental health. That's why it's so important that we understand that as a community, as a group of people, that we need to be aware of the forces that have come together to create the trauma that we experience in our community as a people. I want to deal with collective trauma today. And collective trauma is basically the trauma that's inflicted upon a group of people collectively, not individually, but collectively. And I feel like one of the things that we really need to begin to address is the social trauma or collective social trauma that's been inflicted upon us. And we need to, in order to overcome that trauma, we need to first understand where it came from, why it's there. And I've started a new, I haven't started, but I'm thinking about starting a new page on my Facebook called Real African American History. And so with the idea of real African history is the idea of talking about the side of American history that has affected us mentally and emotionally more than anything. And I know that for the most part, when we're in school, we always hear about the African American history. We hear about Harriet Tubman, Isaac Douglas, Sojourner Truth, Martin Luther King Jr. We hear about those type of individuals, and when we look at slavery, it's always put in a passive role where the impact of slavery is never really taught. But not only was there the impact of slavery, though, but it's also the trauma of the years following when slavery ended, the peonage years. And then we also had the Jim Crow era, in which we were subject to horrible black codes and unfair laws. And then we had the Plessy versus Ferguson, which was the case of the equal but separate, which was another form of discrimination that denied African Americans their basic human dignity, basic human rights. So those type of situations or those events in history were the forces that helped create our collective trauma. And so another thing is important when we talk about our collective trauma is we want to deal with how can we recover from that trauma? What are the signs of that trauma? What is the implication of that trauma? And I think that once we can do that, come to an understanding of how we got to be to the place where we're at now, then I think we can heal. You can't heal what you don't know. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the 13th Amendment and the abolishment of slavery. And I'm going to read to you what the 13th Amendment actually said, and then we're going to talk about it in sort of detail. Let me see here. So, as you all know, the 13th Amendment was supposed to be the amendment that abolished slavery. And it was passed by Congress on January 31st, 1865. And was ratified on December 6, 1865. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the United States. it was the 13th Amendment, which formally abolished slavery in the United States, passed the Senate on April 8, 1864, and the House on January 31st, 1865. So the 13th Amendment the 13th Amendment basically says this, that no person shall be let me find it here so I can read it to you exactly as it's stated in the Constitution. So, because it's important that we understand this this amendment that was passed, ratified. Neither slave nor involuntary I can't read that one, so let me see if I can go to another one here that's readable. I really want to read this to you. And neither slave nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or in any place subject to their jurisdiction. So when you read that 13th Amendment, it clearly says that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime. And so this is the code message in the 13th Amendment, and it's basically saying we can't call you a slave anymore because we're going to abolish slavery unless you're convicted of a crime. And once you've been duly convicted of a crime, then now you can once again become a involuntary servant or a slave. And as a result of that, this particular amendment to the Constitution being put together, and it happened in 1865. So what we're looking at here then is a way to keep black people, mainly black men, in slavery after slavery had been abolished. Slavery had been abolished, and it was to the point now where if we were convicted of a crime, then we could be made a slave again. And sadly to say, those crimes for us as black people during this time meant simply entering into a city. It simply meant looking up in the direction of a pale individual or person or female. It simply meant refusing to take an offer from a pale person. So anything that we could be arrested for became a crime. And as a result, for 89 years, black men mainly were arrested for petty crimes, sentenced to lengthy sentences in prison. And out of the prison was created what was called a prison leasing program, where the inmates were leased out as workers to the farms. And so the contracts were, if I got caught, I went to prison, I had worked for you for 2 years, and you paid me actually I didn't get any money, but you paid the prison a percentage of your harvest for allowing me to be leased to you. So then that way, I had no right, I had no control over my employment. I was basically still a slave, basically working for free. My treatment was no different than slavery, except at this point it was a little more humane than chattel slavery. In pretext it was anyway. You wasn't supposed to be able to beat me or to kill me. However, that didn't stop the pale landowners from abusing the leased black prisoners. So I'm leased out to your farm for 2 years. After those 2 years, I'm supposed to be set free, but if the pale landowner came and said, I didn't like the way he performed, he didn't do his job, he did anything wrong, then I was continually leased out to that landowner. At this point, I had no time limit. Now I have to work for this guy for as long as I'm alive, for as long as I'm sentenced to prison, which in my case, I could have been sentenced for 2 years. Before the 2 years was over with, it turned into 10 years. For that 10 years over, it turned into 30 years. Before you know it, it was life. And not only was I spending life in prison, I was being leased out as a slave. Now, can you imagine the mental anguish and torment that I'm enduring? The brokenness in my spirit, the brokenness in my cognitive processing, my emotional disturbance, my emotional development. Everything is being hindered at this point. Not only that, but I'm being exposed repeatedly to violence because there was no love for me in the prison. There was no love for me on the work farm. So I'm constantly being exposed to violence. And so after I've been worked to death, there was a group of people who went back and exhumed some of those bodies of those men who died during the peonage years. And they discovered that the bones were literally detached from the muscles. That can only occur if you have been worked to death. That's the only way it could happen. So during this period of time, we were worked to death as slaves without any pay, without any say-so in how we were treated as far as having a family, having a structured life. That was out of the question. That is one of the sources of our collective trauma that we are experiencing today. That mental, physical abuse epigenetically was transferred down through generation through generation through generation. Not only was it an epigenetic transmission, it was also a non-epigenetic transmission, which means that it was environmental. Not only biological, but it was also environmental. So when we say environmental, we're dealing with men who, if they made it out of the peonage system, they were so badly damaged. They were no good to themselves or for a family or for any purpose other than to wither away. Those who made it out used, or as a recourse, turned to alcohol, to drugs, anything they could to numb the pain. That's a collective trauma that's passed down to us today. And sadly today, many of us are doing the same thing. We're looking for ways to numb the pain of that collective trauma. So again, it becomes important that we understand how we got to the point that we're at. Why are we experiencing collective trauma? And what can we do about it? How can we heal ourselves from that collective trauma? Well, the first step is understanding why it happened, or what it happened and who it happened to, which was us. And it happened because this country needed free labor in order to become an empire. And rather than treat men fairly, they decided that we were not human, that we didn't need to be treated fairly. So they decided to take advantage of us. They decided to abuse and use us for their own financial gain. The way we recover from that collective trauma is, first of all, we recognize that we are human. We are men. We are valuable. We have purpose. We have worth. Take the time to soothe your mind, to spend time alone with yourself, going over all of your positive aspects. I'm Irvin Wainwright. This is Higher Ground Radio. We deal with mental health, And so, in closing, if you're in a crisis, I want you to call the